All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aurora Public Library District's Youth, Race, and Activism panel. My name is Krista Danis, and I'm the Events and Program Coordinator at the library. It is my pleasure today to introduce you to our panelists and guests, after which I will hand it over to our moderator, Kathy, who will give each of our 4 panelists 10 to 15 minutes to present independently to the topic of youth, race, and activism from their own unique perspectives and experiences, followed by our moderator questions for our students and panelists, and finishing up with questions from the audience. So for those tuning in from Facebook, go ahead and just pop any questions you have into the chat, and my colleague Colleen will send them on over to me. And if you are visiting via Zoom today, you can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We are privileged today to be joined by students from the West Aurora High School Global Minds chapter, whose vision is to reimagine schools as centers for youth voice, cultural understanding, and intercultural friendship. Global Minds is a for youth by youth organization, inspiring students to form social bonds and consider global issues in order to combat cultural intolerance and discrimination. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I'm going to ask each of our students to introduce themselves with their name and their grade and why they joined the Global Minds chapter at West Aurora High School. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sarah Alhaj Ali, and I am a junior at West Aurora High School. And I joined Global Mind because when I was in middle school, it was my first couple years. It was my first 2 years in the middle school, and I was the only person who speak Arabic there. And when they come, I was really shy. I don't want to do anything. I would just stay away. But they convinced me to do stuff, and they make me out of my comfort zone. Like, I'm not afraid of anything now. I can talk out loud with people. And I like about a Global Mind that we learn about each other culture. We learn about what we do, what's the different. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Nadjate?
My name is Nadjate Yacoubou. I'm a junior at West Aurora High School. I joined Global Minds because I thought Global Minds was a club that celebrated cultural diversity. And as an immigrant myself, I wanted to be part of a club that would help others feel included in the West Aurora community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. I am really looking forward to hearing from you in the Q&A. So next, it is my honor to introduce you to our panelists and our moderator today. Shreya Joshi is a rising high school junior from Naperville, Illinois. She firmly believes in the power of youth and Generation Z's ability to create a more inclusive and tolerant society. As a founder of program TEAL, Tolerance, Engagement, Action, and Learning, she strives to share her passion for democracy and political participation through her civic engagement workshops. She also serves on her state representative's Youth Advisory Council. Welcome to our panel today, Shreya.
Thank you so much.
Nicholas Richard-Thompson is the communications coordinator for the city of Aurora, as well as a producer-screenwriter for the film production company Digital Alliance. He is a Columbia graduate and is currently pursuing his master's in public administration from Aurora University. Nicholas serves as a board member for the Goldfinch Cafe. Nick is an abolitionist and organizer in his community, a part of numerous advocacy groups, both local and international, most notably the Black Alliance for Peace, Indivisible Aurora, and the People's Coalition. Above all, Nick strives to be a compassionate human being. Thanks for being here today, Nick. Devin Couturier is a 21-year-old art education major at NIU. She's always been passionate about politics and staying educated. Devin strongly believes in equality and has spoken at many Black Lives Matter events across the suburbs of Chicago. She focuses on topics such as white privilege, whitewashing in our education system, and understanding the root of our nation's deeply embedded inequalities. She believes that while white people are not personally oppressed by racial inequality, it is the responsibility of white people to be educated on their privilege and use it to be an ally to people of color. Hi, Devin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. And Lily Rocha was born in Mexico City, but grew up in Aurora. She attended McCleary, Jefferson, and graduated from West Aurora High School in 2006. Afterwards, Lily attended Columbia University in New York City and graduated in 2010 with a BA in economics and political science. Since then, she's worked as a legislative aide to a U.S. Senator and member of the U.S. House of Representatives, working on education, healthcare, transportation, and mental health federal policy. After Congress, Lily worked as a national anti-sexual assault advocate, working in state legislators across the country to pass survivor-centered reforms. She missed home and moved back to Aurora to work as chief of staff for a local state representative. Outside of work, Lily enjoys running on the Fox Valley trails and reading fiction. Hi, Lily. And last but not least, our moderator today is Kathy Mendoza, who works in adult reference at Santori Library and is active in outreach and programming initiatives for the Aurora Public Library District. She's a recent graduate of Aurora University with a bachelor's in history and has been active in the recent local anti-racist protests. Thank you so much for being here today, Kathy. And now I'm going to hand it over to you to get started.
Hi, everyone. Good to have you all. So we're going to start with just kind of a general question on what it means for you all to be an activist, and who would you consider an activist? Feel free to chime in with any of your activist work. So if we can just go in order of how you were introduced.
Hi. For me personally, being an activist is engaging in real activism than just plain performance activism. It's partaking in strong actions and making changes to your everyday habits and your everyday behaviors to actually achieve the change that you advocate for. So that's what personally being an activist means to me. It's made me into a much more compassionate individual who cares a lot about, who's much more aware of the systemic issues that impact our community and our nation. Personally, my favorite activist is Greta Thunberg. I think she's amazing, and that's just someone who I would consider an activist.
Well, you can go.
Oh, my bad.
It's okay.
Yeah, so I think what it means to me to be an activist, I kind of don't actually use the word in my vocabulary too much. The words that I typically use are organizer. I'll even use revolutionary or visionary, right? And I think what it means, though, if we're going to be using activism, it's somebody who engages meaningfully in their community and is doing work for advocacy from, geopolitical issues, socioeconomic issues, and doing some type of justice work. And I think it's people who are concerned with humanity, concerned with injustice, concerned with, and improving the conditions of workers, improving the conditions of, our allies. So I know people and groups that I recognize as, I guess, would be activists, or Ajima Baraka, who is the head spokesperson for the Black Lions for Peace. And, someone who, reading his work, introduced me to anti-war, anti-imperialist analysis in activism on a local level, and why those type of things are very tied to domestic issues and how you can tie them to local issues, right? The oppression and occupation of Black communities is very similar to the oppression and occupation overseas on a continent or in the Middle East, So the militarization of police departments is closely interlinked to the militarization we see globally from that U.S. hegemonic rule. So I think activists like that, Margaret Kimberly, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolitionists that I read their work, and it's inspired me to be, a person that tries to understand, the interconnectedness of abolition and gender inequities as well. So, yeah.
Well, I feel like, for a lot of people, activism doesn't have to be this famous name that we all know. I mean, that's wonderful, and those are amazing people that we should look up to. I think that you can find activism in everyday life, from the conscious choices that you make. From a young age, I know personally I was like this, and a lot of people are like this, is they don't agree with what's going on. And when you're a kid, you're just told that that's not the way things work, and you don't understand because you're a kid. And then you get into middle school and you don't agree, and you're still told that you don't know the real world. And then you educate yourself throughout high school and even now into the 20s, and I'm educating myself, and I feel like I have a great grasp, and I'm still told that that's not how things work. Well, why can't they work that way? Why can we not have equality? Why can we not have healthcare? And why can we not abolish the police and the police brutality? It just, the rules are made by people who have power, and the people who don't have power are forced against each other. So I find great inspiration in everyday activists that have no power, such as the woman Isabella Irish is just graduated from Batavia High School. She set up the Batavia Black Lives Matter. Amber Shannon is a woman of color who set up things in St. Charles for Juneteenth. I find great great activism in everyday life, and those who are constantly told again and again and again that they're not going to make a difference and that they don't have power, and they continue to do so because they believe that's what's right.
Great, and I don't know that I have much more to add. You guys did such a great job of answering the question, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, activism means having a strong belief about how something should work and then taking action to implement that vision. And so I think it could work in a few different ways. It could be, you know, at a very small nuclear level where it's you just thinking, hey, I'd like my school to offer this club and they don't, so how do I make it happen? It could be anything from the tenant who is like, hey, like, I'm not sure why there's a safety hazard in the basement, but I'm gonna try to get some tenants to talk to the landlord and fix that. Or, you know, it could be somebody who is feeling very strongly about any of the big issues such as police brutality or climate change, and they're marching and they're writing to their legislators and they're donating. So I think there's so many different ways that you can be an activist, and I think oftentimes people get a little bit scared or nervous, like they're not doing enough or they're not doing it the right way. But I will say that for everybody, there's just different ways, and it also depends on your personality. I think I have friends who are just a little bit more shyer and they're just never going to go to a march. It's just not in their personality, but they donate to organizations that they believe are doing the right work. I have at the same time friends who maybe don't have a lot of money right now, but they are emailing their congressmen, they're calling their legislators, they're writing letters. So, you know, there's just a lot of different ways to do it. And so who do I think is an activist? It could be just an everyday person who is like, hey, that's not right. Hey, we need to change that. And it could be anybody from, you know, we heard a lot of community members recently calling their aldermen for the first time, and they're realtors, they're teachers, they're parents, they're activists. Anyone to, you know, Elizabeth Warren is someone I really admire because prior to being a senator, she fought and lobbied for creating an agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to protect consumers against the financial industry, which tends to prey on people of color and low-income people. And she lobbied for years to get that to happen, and she did, and it became an agency that's currently, you know, at the federal level. So I think there's so many different ways and so many different layers, and I think you know, I'd encourage people to explore different ways and see what makes sense to you, what feels comfortable for you. You know, maybe you feel uncomfortable in marches. That's okay. You can still do something. Maybe you find out that you love being behind a megahorn. Like, that's awesome. So, you know, experiment, try different ways, and yeah, I think you'll find your footing pretty quickly.
Sorry, I was muted. So next, I just want to hear panelists about your personal experiences. Thank you for sharing what you think it means an activist. So some of your own activist work, if you have anything to place as screen share, go ahead and do that at this time. So take a few minutes and don't feel rushed. Go ahead and tell us your personal experience and how you've been an activist in the community.
Would you like us to go in the same order as before?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Just as a reminder, I guess, my name is Shreya Joshi, and I'm currently a high school junior. I'm so excited and grateful to be here today because it's so important that we discuss and learn more about these important issues. Personally, I do a lot of work related to social justice, advocacy, and civic engagement. I also serve on my state representative's youth council, where I'm currently writing legislation to improve the current framework for reporting sexual assault in public schools. But through my involvement in these extracurriculars, I've learned that civic engagement is about working with other people in your community to create positive change for the common public good. And that's why I'm a firm believer that civic engagement is fundamental to the foundation of a just and democratic society. However, through my involvement in these same extracurriculars, I've also become aware of the severe civic engagement crisis that is currently affecting our nation. The problem at hand is that young people aren't actively participating in government. This is because many young people are perhaps dissuaded by the idea of government, which contributes to their lack of participation and overall apathy towards governance. And because of youth apathy, politicians are less likely to focus on issues important to the youth. Thus, this causes young people to further distance themselves from the government. So it's kind of an endless cycle here. And especially personally growing up in a STEM-oriented community, I've seen and witnessed firsthand this apathy even in my own school. It's hard to actually get students to care about these issues and civic engagement beyond the activities that they participate in for college applications. And so this kind of experience is what inspired me to start Project Teal. Project Teal is a bipartisan initiative that aims to teach middle and elementary school students about the importance of social justice and political activism through civic engagement workshops. So for the past year, I've just been going to different local libraries, hosting this program, and talking to many students in our community. Through this program, I hope to share my own passion for democracy and civic engagement with other students, and also hopefully motivate younger people to get involved from earlier on. This program is actually what connected me to the Aurora Public and the reason why I'm speaking here today. This past summer, I actually worked to further grow and expand Project Teal with the Citizen Advocacy Center, which is a legal advocacy organization that's dedicated to promoting government accountability and transparency. As part of this summer project, I had to create digital programming for 2 virtual civic engagement forums. The first forum revolved around ensuring free and fair elections in a pandemic, which focused on voter registration procedures, safely voting through voting by mail and early voting options, the Illinois Omnibus Election Bill, and the importance of democratic elections in a pandemic. The second forum centered on civic advocacy and mobilization, which focused on the logistics of grassroots advocacy, the power of public pressure in influencing elected officials and enforcing government accountability, and community organizing. So as a student activist, both of these topics were really close to my heart. And in all honesty, my whole experience with Project Teal has just turned me into a more compassionate person and someone who is just more willing to listen and learn to those around me. So just before I wrap up here, I just wanted to say that in today's climate, where more and more people are at the very least becoming familiar with the term activism and starting to self-identify as an activist, it's really important that we not only define what activism actually means, but also ensure that we're engaging in real activism and not performance activism. In order to bring about true social change, it's so important that we avoid bandwagoning just for something as insignificant as social status, and instead that we truly devote ourselves to causes that are important for us and change our everyday habits and behaviors to actively advocate for them. So I'm sure that we'll be discussing this more later, but I just wanted to quickly mention that. Thank you all so much for having me here today, and I'm really looking forward to this thought-provoking and engaging discussion.
Thank you for putting that so eloquently. Again, my name is Richard-Thompson. So my early activism kind of started when I was at community college and undergrad. And what we did was actually outside of the political apparatus and outside of electoralism. We did what was considered direct action. So I got together with some people who were like-minded individuals, and we adopted the Black Panther model, the Young Lords and the Young Patriots. And what they focused on is mutual aid, which is like being concerned with your community and having a responsibility to each other. So if you needed food, we got you food. If you needed someone to drive you somewhere, we drove you somewhere. If the elderly needed services, we provided it. Whatever the community asked for, we provided it. And we went to the most repressed and depressed communities that are neglected, right? Oftentimes, electoralism ignores these. Like, I've been on campaigns where they're like, oh, we won't go to this neighborhood because they don't vote, right? I've heard that verbatim. So for me, a lot of times what I'm concerned with is mass movement building, because my analysis is that benevolent leaders don't exist. The charismatic leader is a bad model and they don't change anything, right? So what the civil rights movement happened because of mass organizing, right? You know, women's suffrage movement happened because of mass organizing. Anti-war movements happened because of mass organizing. You know, people coming together collectively, right? Oftentimes, through a colonial logic, we'll see history kind of misconstrued what happened and prop up one individual. Like, I love Malcolm X, but Malcolm X was very focused on building mass movements of people. You know, Martin Luther King, one thing that people try to do is say he was like the entire movement. We study that. Somebody who I'm really influenced by is Ella Baker. And she always talked about walking among the people, right? And she said this quote where she said, the movement made Martin, the Martin didn't make the movement. So mass movement building is the only thing historically that has changed and transformed society. and altered the fabric of it, right? So it's people, mass movements of people. So for me, direct action provides that, right? When you start addressing the needs and satisfying the needs of the most oppressed communities because the institutions refuse to or are unwilling, all of a sudden they will listen to you and say, okay, what's the political education about this? You can explain the conditions of why they live in, you know, subpar housing, why they have subpar healthcare, why they have terrible jobs where they get exploited and don't have good benefits. You start explaining and connecting things like capitalism and racism, and they see that and it makes sense, right? So for me, my activism has always been rooted in mass movement building, connecting people, right? You know, most people always tell me like, Nick, I see you everywhere. And the reason for that is I believe in like addressing things and showing that there's an interconnectedness in all of our struggles, right? So liberation is gonna not happen through one struggle. It's gonna happen through all the struggles when we notice it. And I saw glimpses of it in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? People started tying the economic question of why you only got $1,200 during a pandemic. They started tying why the rent moratorium we're on a precipice of a housing crisis, right? They start tying, right, ecological disaster to the nature of capitalism, right? And this is how you build mass movements of people who say, well, listen, we see the core causal root is an economic system that is disinterested in empowering people. It necessitates inequality, it's destroying the planet, and it produces perpetual warfare on other continents, right? So once you like start doing mass movement building like that, that's what changes, right? So then I don't have to appeal to the consciousness of somebody who's lobbied by money interest, disinterested, or doesn't have the information, right? So when you have mass movements, you don't have to make those compromises because you have the power of the people, right? The power of the people is always going to be more impactful than the people in power, right? So for me, the moral consciousness is always in the mass movements. It's always in the mass movements of people, working class, the poor, the oppressed, the wretched of the earth. These are the people who really are the change agents of society historically. So my activism has always been about providing political education, going to the most repressed communities, going to, you know, I organize a lot with the houseless, the formerly incarcerated, you know, undocumented people. These are the people who I think have a revolutionary consciousness because they are the most marginalized, right? So they have a better perspective because they aren't close and tied to the interest of maintaining these colonial institutions, right? They recognize the need to subgroup and replace these institutions because they've never benefited from it, right? Someone who benefits from these institutions, it's more difficult to get them to see that, yo, we got to get rid of it, right? There is no reforming certain things. You couldn't have reformed slavery. I tell this all the time. I joke when I do presentations. There was no giving the slave more water or better hours or whipping them nicely. You had to get rid of slavery. It had to be abolished. In certain institutions, it's the same way, right? As abolitionists, we recognize the prison industrial complex is the same thing. It is there to control socially people who have gone against the colonial logic of what is crime, right? They hypercriminalize these people. They racialize them, you know, as a biological fact where we know race is a social construct. And then we see that it's really a class issue of why we have overfilled prisons. And then the prison system itself is $1 billion industry, right? So this is to me no different than the nature and the mode of production that slavery was. So that's why certain institutions just must be abolished. There is no reforming it, right? So I like to try my best to organize on a political education, mutual aid, and direct action, right? We will do protests and stuff like that, but more so the organizations early on that I got involved with was just going directly to the people who are not getting their needs met by the colonial institutions. So for me, that's super important to combine struggles, combine issues, and have these conversations with people who are apolitical or disinterested and show them why they should be involved politically.
Oh, okay. So, well, basically, I've always been outspoken ever since I was young. I grew up in a conservative Catholic household or Christian household, and I didn't agree with it at all. And so from a young age, I was hearing things in the house, and I was thinking, like, I don't know if that's what I really am feeling. And so I started to educate myself, and, you know, throughout high school, I got really into it. That's the first time I was hearing about feminism, the prison industrial complex, and there was all of these things that I was learning, and I was like, how come I didn't know this? How come we're not learning about this? This is vital information. And because our education system is Eurocentric whitewash, and it is made to produce good workers who get good test scores and get into good schools and get good jobs and flow into capitalism. We don't focus on empathy. We don't focus a lot on humanities, arts, viewing each other as mutual beings with our own, you know, we don't learn empathy, right? So what happens is if you're learning a Eurocentric type education and you're not learning how to have empathy for others who are poorer than you, who have different obstacles than you, then you go and you enter the workforce in the world and you continue to perpetrate these unequal or just unjust ideologies. And so basically, I've always been outspoken. I was in, Latinos Unidos and part of MECHA in my community college, and now this is my first semester at NIU, so it's hard to be into activism, but I've given speeches in St. Charles Black Lives Matter, St. Charles Juneteenth, Elburn Black Lives Matter, Batavia Black Lives Matter, at churches and stuff like this. And so it's kind of like, I feel like as a white person who is not oppressed, I see other white people who either have no clue what's going on because they don't care, or they educate themselves and they say, oh, that's just so bad that that's going on. I'm educated now. I'm an activist because I know what's going on because I posted my black screen. Well, education without action is futile. It just means nothing. You can know all you want, but then at the end of the day, they say, oh, ignorance is bliss. I just wish I didn't have to worry all about this. And that is the most privileged thing that white people have, is that that's just something that they have to worry about in the back of their heads, that they don't experience it. They don't have to deal with it. They don't have to worry about their kids. And so the thing that I find funny oftentimes is my goal is to educate white people and say that, like, yes, we didn't produce slavery, but we benefit from a system where every single day we are riding through on our privilege. So why do we not want to see other people strive as easy as we're striving? Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, to wrap this up, but like, people often think, when I speak about white privilege and how we need to step up, they always say, well, like, oh, that's just so great that you're into all this. Or like, it's just really amazing. This should be the bare minimum. Every white person or non-person of color, however you identify, should be this outraged. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, this should not be some random thing. I've had conversations with people of color who literally tell me that they have never heard a white person be educated on their privilege, be wanting to help Black and brown people in the way like this. And it's just outlandish to me that we have completely just whitewashed and brainwashed people into feeling like police brutality is not an issue, or white people will say, well, police brutality happens to white people too. Well, then why are you not outraged? I remember in my Batavia speech, I had this quote that said, if you are more outraged by a Target being looted than the target put on Black people's back in America, you are part of the problem. And I had all of these old people on Facebook messaging me and telling me that that's outlandish and that doesn't happen. And then we see what just Jacob Blake, it just happened right there. That's literally exactly what happened. And so I feel like I'm going to become an educator, and my goal is to work in the inner cities with Black and brown children and inspire them through art to find their worth, to find, the spark inside of them. I don't know, I guess, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, again, all wonderful answers. I think for me, it's I feel like I've done some activism on my spare time, and then I've been a professional advocate where it was my 9 to 5, and so I worked with the Joyful Heart Foundation based in New York City. And so we're an anti-sexual assault organization. And so my job was to go to different state legislatures, and we had a packet of 6 bills specifically designed to end the rape kit backlog and support survivors. So oftentimes when a survivor goes to the hospital, there's DNA is collected for the assault, and then it's supposed to be sent to the police, and then it's supposed to be sent to a lab, or it's supposed to be analyzed, and then supposed to be updated into a national database. Of course, what we found is a lot of times that doesn't happen, and it has to do with, again, bias against survivors of sexual assault, of, believing that there isn't a real victim, oh, she was drinking, oh, men can't get raped, all of those things that we hear. So my job, I found it extremely fulfilling to be my 9 to 5 was to be like, hey, that's not okay. And so going to different legislatures and being like, what if we introduce these bills to get the rape kits counted, to change the policies on how they're handled, to give more funding and resources to survivors of sexual assault, to make sure that we're annually counting them so we provide some transparency, and that we're just generally tracking where this evidence is going. And so it was surprisingly kind of difficult to get these bills through because they often carried a fiscal price tag with them. So, you know, we'd have legislators being like, yeah, that's great. And then be like, okay, it's going to cost $2 million. And they're like, okay, we don't have the money for that, but we definitely want to do it. And I'm like, okay, well, also police should have been doing this for decades. And the reason you're paying this money is because the police wasn't doing their job. So here we are. But so I had to come at it with really a lot of different skill sets. And a lot of what I had to do was understanding the political and policy landscapes of different states. So what worked in Alaska was not going to work in Texas, was not going to work in Massachusetts. So understanding the politics and policies of those states, devising advocacy campaigns based on that knowledge, and then working with partners. One thing that has to be, you can't do the work without other people. You just can't. So a lot of my time was spent going into these states and talking to the rape crisis centers, talking to the survivor networks, talking to the sexual assault forensic nurses, talking to the crime lab directors, and just talking to everybody and getting that the relationships built to understand the issues and be able to get their buy-in for what they want to see as reform. Because one thing I said is when I started this work is survivors have to be at the front and center of this work. They cannot, like, their voices have to lead this, otherwise it's meaningless to do this for them because that's patronizing. And so I, you know, would often work with survivors. I'd be like, hey, what do you think of this bill? Anything needs to change? What do you want to see change? And if there was any edits or anything that they wanted, we made sure that that worked. Then we built coalitions to get those bills passed. We found legislative sponsors, we found media coverage, we found allies, and we came together and we put pressure on legislatures to pass these reforms. And we had varying successes, but for the most part, you know, there were about 10 states that passed at least, I think, 2 bills in the about 3 years that I was there, including anywhere from Massachusetts, which passed 5 of our 6 bills in one legislative session, because we were doing a really strong push, and we had a legislator who was a survivor herself, and she made sure that this bill was going to go through. So, you know, that's kind of advocacy was my 9 to 5, and it was a very fulfilling role, and I loved it. And I would say anybody who's interested in doing it as a full-time job, I would say get expertise in an area. I think the way you become a really strong policy advocate is by really understanding the subject matter. So, you know, I tell people, like, if you're interested in climate change, like, become a climate change scientist first. You know, if you're interested in healthcare, maybe become a doctor, or maybe, you know, become a healthcare administrator. Once you really understand how the system works, you can change it because you give very specific, very robust recommendations to change the system, and you understand who the key players are. So, you know, there's a lot of pathways to advocacy, but definitely understanding the issues very intimately is going to get you very far. And then I guess outside of my work, just in my personal space, I've recently picked it up, I think, because I was so like, okay, it's my 9 to 5. I don't really want to go home and like write to my legislators because I spent the whole day talking to legislators, and I really don't want to go to March because, like, this is just my job, to be honest. I don't have the energy for that. What now that I work for, you know, a state legislator, I have a little bit more time, I think, on the side to kind of work on issues. And I think with that, and is I like educating people about how the systems work and how they don't work and where they can plug themselves in. But I also like giving people confidence, because I think what lacks, I think what a lot of youth lack, whether it's Gen Z, millennials, or anybody who just hasn't been part of the process, is confidence. Confidence in your ability to create change, confidence in your ability to get your voice heard, confidence in your ability to stand strong. And I think just giving people that, like, hey, like, you have a story and you're valuable and you have the ability to make change because you matter, I think that's something that most people don't hear. And I think, and what I really like is kind of getting people that just that confidence to take this on themselves, because as much as I feel like I could lead things, I think that's a part of it. I think I also want to empower people so that they can do it on their own, because everybody should be able to have this skill set. And so that's kind of how I, look at it from that perspective.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go in the same order, just going to answer a few of the questions. Some of these you've kind of touched on, but I would just like a little bit more elaboration. So how do you view today's youth engagement in activism versus past generations? What can we learn from them? And what can we do differently? So let's go in the same order.
Kathy, do you mind if I interrupt real quick? Sorry, Shreya.
Yeah.
I did want to just note and welcome Valeria Rangel to the conversation. Thanks for being here. She's one of our students from West Aurora. And this is the point where we're going to be hearing from the three of you as well. So everyone together is going to kind of answer and discuss these questions that Kathy asks. So thanks everybody for being here, and sorry for interrupting.
Thank you. So yeah, let's start with Shreya, and then afterwards we can go, the high school students can answer. We can start with Sarah once we get to the high school students.
Yeah, no worries. I think that today's engagement in activism is actually much higher than past generations. However, I don't think it's because there's anything super unique about our generation. I think it's because we're privileged to live in a digital age where most people have access to the internet. Because of this internet access, people can now do their own research, form their own opinions, and educate themselves on these issues, whereas before, most people just took on the opinions of their parents. And in addition to just pure education, internet also connects people with organizations and other like-minded people who advocate for the issues that they care about. So likely, I don't think that this high engagement in activism is because there's anything different with our generation. I just think it's because we're fortunate enough to live in a time where the majority of people do have access to the internet. With that being said, I do think that older activists have a lot of valuable experience to share as they remain active partners in these movements themselves. Collaboration has a potential to be such a powerful tool. But going forward, we need to continue fighting for a seat at the table, continue having these difficult conversations about inclusion and about equity, because the people in power will never really listen until the people who are oppressed and marginalized make them. That is just a sad fact of reality. And so having these difficult conversations is the only way that we can ensure the sustainability of these social movements and continue to push for social change.
Okay. I think for me, there's a lot happening around. It's not just in the United States with the Black Lives Matter in here. There's a lot around happen, like in the Middle East, there's a lot of women being killed because they're thinking weird. Like they're thinking, oh, if they do that, they're gonna be killed. Like there's a lot of stuff happening that's not acceptable around. Like even like in China, there's a lot of Muslims being killed because this is their religion. Like they're being killed, they're being taken to jails, doing stuff that they doesn't want to do. Like why do they do that? Just because they want to be, this is their religion? Like you cannot judge anyone because of that. There's a lot of people, they doesn't listen. They just thinking like, it doesn't matter. Like I see a lot of people being racist, like even on social media, they say stuff to others like it's gonna hurt them. You say stuff like it's gonna hurt, but like they're not gonna show you that you hurt them by your word, by what you're saying. There's like, even like we have social media right now and we see a lot of stuff what's going on around. There's still a lot of people are not educated. They still like doesn't think like different. Like in here, like even here, like as a color, like we make separation between colors. This is like something like we're all the same. Like we don't look at the outside, we look at our inside, because our skin color is not going to show who we are. Our skin color doesn't make a difference of what we are. Like there's like in everywhere we go, there is like a good people and bad people. There's a different, we have a different with everything. Like if we all have the same skin color, it's not going to be the same. There's like, we have different stuff like to be special.
Okay, Nick, if you want to answer, and then we can have a high school student follow up on the youth engagement today versus in the past.
For sure. I'll try to keep it brief. I think today we have different modes of technology to engage with. So it spreads faster, but I read a study that misinformation spreads faster than the actual truth. So that's dangerous to be mindful of. But I think youth are engaging in the ways of their material conditions, right? Today's just different. The issues are very similar, but how they do the work is different. And I think that's good. And there's a lot to learn from the past movements. And again, I think a key difference is mobilization and organization. There's a speech by Kwame Ture you can look up on YouTube. All you got to do is type in organization versus mobilization. He'll go into the details, but essentially, I think this youth generation is very mobilized. An issue will show up and then they mobilize to do protests, rallies, and it lasts, but it isn't sustained. Organizing is separate because this is sustained movements over time and they eventually accomplish more. And I think I think it's imperative for our generation to learn from the past movements and sprout out more organization and more organizational power so that we can have sustained movements and not have to rely, again, on institutions that have failed you for centuries, for decades, that aren't going to change anytime soon unless you decide to change them, right? So I think the power, again, is in the people who are doing these movements. And one of the key differences is just sustained movements versus not sustained, right? I think I'm seeing a couple sprouting movements on like a housing crisis is happening. I'm seeing people doing rent strikes, which is great. I'm seeing more worker strikes, which is great. But like there's a study that said from 2012 to now, the collective strikes was about major strikes was like 12, right? That's bad, or 12 in each year. Whereas in the early 60s, 70s, they had 400 strikes in a year, right? So they have sustained movements that accomplish more, like getting labor rights, getting children not working. There's so many things that are different. I think it's because they have sustainability in their movements rather than reactionary, right? Ooh, let's go get out and do this. But then what are we doing afterwards, right? And I think there's reasons for that. I think capitalism is sometimes will keep people disengaged because you have to go work. Your labor is tied to your survival. So it's difficult to, one, stay informed, stay engaged. But two, have the desire to go be out in the streets. And I think we saw more people engage politically now because we had COVID, right? A lot of people were laid off from work. So that's, I think a critical component of sustainability. Are you going to be organized or are you going to mobilize? And, what's going to eventually get you the change you want to see?
And then if we could have, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Nadjate?
I personally think compared to the past, youth activism, youth engagement activism has grown because of social media. In the past, although you heard about horrible things that were happening, there were in newspapers, there were pictures. Not a lot of people read newspapers or pictures, but now because of social media, no matter where you look, you see it. You see videos, you see hashtags, so people can't ignore it. So that's activism has grown.
Devin, did you want to chime in?
So I feel like activism is definitely seen more as something that is attainable for everybody. I feel like before, again, not people didn't have the confidence to go out and do things that they believed in just because it wasn't the status quo. I feel like I said, well, I'm really focused on education. That's why I'm going to be an educator. I really feel like our education system focuses on things that don't really further the soul and understanding and empathy. So I feel like before social media, it was everyone for themselves. And now, because our education system is failing us when teaching us about these things that are going on or about diversity on social media, we get to see people who don't look like us, who don't live like us, who don't believe in the things that we do. And it's opening our mindsets and being like, I didn't even know that this was a problem. So I think a lot of times now, there are so many inequalities that are being brought to light. You know, the prison industrial complex, education is inaccessible, and it oppresses Black and brown students in more than a million ways that I cannot even get into right now. The LGBTQIA things in other countries that we couldn't have possibly known about with our capitalistic, Eurocentric, whitewashed media. And I feel like that has caused people to have this spark lit in them that maybe wouldn't have been possible before. And I feel like, again, this was mentioned because of COVID, a lot of us weren't having traditional school, we weren't working, and for once in our lives, we were like, a lot of people during COVID were finding themselves for the first time because they were being pushed out of what we feel freedom is, and they were experiencing true freedom. And it was like, and some of it is performative. Some people posted their black screen, they went to the protest, they held their sign, they made their Instagram post, and that's it. They're done, you know? But I feel like a lot of people are just have this new spark and this new, we're dissatisfied with the government. We're dissatisfied that the people in power have all the money and all the control, and all of the people who deserve say don't have it. I just think that it's a time for a revolution, and people are recognizing that.
Thank you. I know Valeria, you just joined us. Did you have anything to add?
I think that nowadays with couples will like influence them to realize that if they see something, it could like change things, and I feel like that's when things that want to change just a group of people.
It's kind of hard to hear. Okay, let's, Lily, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've noticed about Gen Z in particular, and maybe it's because you're the most diverse American generation, but there's this recognition that issues are intersected and that race is embedded in all these issues, and that's wonderful. I mean, I've worked back when I was working in an anti-sexual assault field. I would, talk to advocates who were older, who'd been, fighting this since the 70s and the 80s, and they had a very siloed approach to sexual assault, and it was, just working on this. And obviously, I support their work, and I'm very thankful for everything that they've done. But it's what, when I would bring up like, oh, well, we also need to think about how undocumented survivors might have different obstacles, or what about Indigenous, or what about Black, or what about low-income survivors, what about sex workers, bringing up different identities and different backgrounds that could impact how you receive care, how you're treated, how you perceive your own assault. And I noticed that these older activists kind of shied away from that. It seemed like they were kind of uncomfortable, and, most of them were older white women. And I think, talking about race and in a way that, something that gives them some privilege, I think make them uncomfortable, because I think they didn't really know how to reconcile with that when they've identified so much with sexual assault survivors who have been marginalized really forever. And so I think there was some reckoning that they had to do there. But I think with Gen Z, something that I see as different is that you guys kind of understand the intersectionality of different issues, and understand how, fighting racial injustice is fighting, economic injustice. It's gonna, tackle climate change. It's gonna help, voter disenfranchisement. It's just kind of a thread that I think is what built The country, I mean, this country was built on literally the Constitution saying that, you know, Black people are 60% of one white person. So to deny the fact that race and, you know, wasn't embedded into every aspect of American society is kind of short-sighted. And so I'm really glad to see Gen Z, in particular, I think us millennials also kind of are doing it, but I definitely see it a lot more with, you know, high school students and young college students. So I think that's awesome.
Thank you. So I think for the next couple of questions, we don't have to go in a specific order. Anyone can kind of chime in, just obviously make sure not to speak over each other so we can understand you. So kind of related to that, what issues have youth brought to the greater public attention in the last 5 years? And how have these issues been received by politicians, presidential candidates, and the news?
I mean, I can go first. I think the issues, you said what issues have been brought to like the forefront in the last 5 years? Okay. I think some of the issues that got brought to the forefront that definitely is youth led is the connection of climate change and, you know, the capitalist mode of production, right? These kids are not committed to this mode of production. They're not committed to the gender binary. They're not committed to any of the old colonial logics that have been pressed upon them, right? They're questioning everything. You know what I'm saying? They recognize gender as a construct. They recognize capitalism is unethical, and they push back against all that. Whereas I think I've talked to a lot of old Panthers, and they said one of the biggest things that destroyed their movement outside of the FBI literally killing them and like falsely imprisoning them was that fighting against Cold War propaganda, right? And the Cold War propaganda era lasted until like the early 2010s, right? And outside of that, more, I think the discourse changed and it started becoming safer to advocate for like socialist ideas, right? And for a long time there, you really couldn't, right? The Black Panther Party was an openly revolutionary communist organization that organized in their community, that empowered their communities, and was systematically destroyed, right, by the federal government. So this generation is, I think, doing the work, doing the history. I talk to kids, when I go out and talk to these kids, they're already informed of the counterintelligence program. I've talked to people who are in their 50s who have never heard of the counterintelligence program, right, by the FBI. They've never heard of some of the operations and the militarization of Latin America or the continent of Africa, installing dictators, America doing this. They don't know this. I talk to these kids, they're like, oh no, I know about that. And I'm like, whoa, right? So these kids are destroying the American exceptionist logic that has been pressed upon a lot of generations, and it's ending. And I think because that these logics and these mythologies are ending, that's why you have more openness to sexuality and gender and new ideas of how we can empower people, like new economic, you know, systems that can actually not create inequality, but create equity, that could create opportunity and prosperity, right? So I'm really excited to see where it goes, because these kids, I think, do rigorous study, and they're in it. Like, they're in the direct action. They're online advocating. Even, I think TikTok, my nephews be showing me TikTok. I think TikTok a powerful tool. You're taking really large ideas and compressing it in a 1-minute video for the attention span of the generation, right? I think that's powerful. I think sometimes people like criticize it, but like reality is like these kids are making it their own and they're doing it their own way. And that's what's really important, you know? So all power to y'all.
Well, I think that the younger generation has become more knowledgeable about things that don't affect them. So like previously, if you were a white woman, you were probably only really worried about, you know, feminism for yourself. Or if you were in the LGBTQIA community, you pretty much were only really worried about yourself. But I feel like now we have tied them all together. I think the younger generation, I feel like older generations were, you know, those older activists were fantastic in their own, like, little bubble, if you know what I mean. But I feel like the younger generation, with all of the knowledge at our fingertips, we've started to tie them into each other. We've started to see how capitalism, I mean, we have a neoliberalistic society where education is for profit. Okay, so if education's for profit and, you know, the criminal justice and indoctrination is for profit, and we started to realize that everything is for profit, and things that don't make our government profit are not pushed, they're not taken care of. Do you see what I'm saying? So I feel like the younger generation has tied in poverty with education, with imprisonment, with everything. And I feel like that's something where, at least to my knowledge, it wasn't widespread like that they're all connected. Because if you really look at inequalities, they're all pretty much connected through one place or another. And I feel like that has encouraged others to care about things that wouldn't normally affect them. And I feel like that is so beautiful. This new waft of empathy that many people have that has been missing for so long is just really something that is exciting with the younger generation. Empathy with action, because there's lots of people who have empathy and they still vote against people's interests because of what benefits them personally, you know. Yeah.
And then sorry, go ahead.
I think like right now, most people going with the trend, like if something got on a trend, everyone talk about it for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and then done. They doesn't talk about it anymore. Like it's just a trend where like they go with a trend. They doesn't stay talking about it, support it. They talk about it just when it's a trend. This is, I think, what mostly happening in social media. Like it's a trend. They go with it for 2 days, 3 days, then they stop. It doesn't go like they keep going with it. That's what I think it's happening mostly right now.
Yeah, and you know, just kind of addressing the second part of the question, has it been taken up by politicians and the media? Well, you know, first of all, politician, I kind of hate that word. Just there's so many connotations with that, right? And I think it does a disservice to really understanding what's going on. And so when you're talking about, because a politician could be a school board member to the president, it could be a county board member, and it could be state legislator, it could be a U.S. senator, it could be the county clerk, right? So there's so many different ways that somebody can be an elected official and still have the ability to influence things. So how have these elected officials, you know, paid attention? I think at varying degrees, but I think the smarter ones, the younger ones, are paying attention because they realize that, well, millennials are already, you know, starting to get into Congress. Millennials are already starting to have, you know, more executive and powerful roles. And it's only a matter of logic that eventually Gen Z will get there. So I think some of the younger elected officials are paying attention because they know that this is going to be their future voter base, to be very honest. And I think some of them, I think you have the ability to persuade and influence some of these younger elected officials. I think the older ones, maybe the ones who are near retirement or who don't, you know, are very much a boomer. I don't know if I should use that phrase because I know it has certain connotations. It can be prerogative, but I'm trying to, you know, be respectful. But anyways, people from that generation, as they retire, you know, I think they have less incentive to be responsive to the general public versus the people that have put them in office for the past 20, 30 years, which tends to be people of their same age, you know, their peers. So I think it might be a bit more difficult to get a response from elected officials that are older. And I think it's also easier, just a life thing, right? That like you dismiss younger generations because they're just kids. And so I think there's a bit of that mentality as well, or like, oh, well, it's because they don't really understand things, or once they get older, you know, they'll really understand, or once they see their paycheck, they'll understand why taxes are bad. You know, all these things that kind of come up as a way to dismiss your youth. So, you know, I think at varying levels, you know, you see somebody like AOC, obviously, who is a millennial, she's about my age, and she, you know, is kind of carrying the democratic socialist, you know, mantle. But then you also see somebody like, what's his name, Madison Crawford, I believe, who's a 24-year-old disability advocate, I believe, who is in South Carolina. And he's now likely to be elected to Congress. And he's, I think, going to be one of the first Gen Zers in Congress, but he's a strong Trump supporter. So, you know, understanding that even this generation, as enlightened as I think they are and as intuitive as they are to a lot of issues that other generations might not have really been as sensitive to, I think there's still, you know, I don't want to conflate it as being like, oh, you know, everybody's, you know, leaning towards some political ideology, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think the media is trying to convey you guys as a monolith. And I think, again, that does a disservice to really understanding what the important issues are.
Yeah, I think that everyone did a really good job of covering that, but mental health, climate change, racial justice, economic inequality, menstrual justice, LGBTQ rights, all of these are really, really important issues that the younger generations have brought to the national spotlight in the last few years. And I think this is because, I think Lily mentioned this earlier, but the fact is that one, we're used to being told that we're too young to know anything. We're used to being ignored and excluded by the people in charge. And two, the fact is that most of these issues directly affect us. And if they don't affect us now, they most definitely will affect us in the future, like climate change, for example. And because of this, many young people, I think that's actually one of the biggest reasons for why they may be discouraged from getting involved in politics, because their beliefs and concerns and values are being ignored by the people in authority. So the best thing that I could personally say just to overcome these challenges is by reaching out to people who also believe in the same values and ideas that you do. So whether if you and a group of friends decide to go to a protest, or maybe you and your friend write a petition for changing your school dress code, that is still an example of collaborative advocacy. And it's just another way of showing that your voice matters and trying to bring the issues that you care about to the spotlight of your representatives.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? Otherwise, I can ask the next question. That's actually perfect. So I was just wanting to know a little bit more about your own personal activism. So what are some ways that your work or activism has changed the perspective of others, either an individual level or in a larger group? And then when discussing race in particular with people who may not agree or know too much about the topic, what approaches have you taken so you don't burn yourself out? Because as Shreya mentioned, also mental health is kind of a big thing now. So I want to make sure that, as an activist, it can be tiring, and you've talked about the challenges. So what are some ways that you've kind of have approached other people who may have a different view?
Oh, well, I can go. Well, so personally, I am obviously white, I don't experience any sort of racial discrimination. So the thing that I find is a lot of, Aurora is pretty diverse, but I'm in Batavia, where it's pretty white. And so I went in front of a ton of white people, and I told them that they have this privilege, and that in one of my speeches, I went over a ton of different ways in which that people might be contributing to the problems, where they might not even know they're contributing to them. Do you see what I'm saying? So I was pointing out everyday things that white people do that one could do to use their privilege for good. And I find that allyship isn't always the proper word, because allyship does insinuate charity, when in my opinion, this isn't charity. This is a problem that our ancestors have created, that we are benefiting from, that needs to be dismantled. And it is our responsibility. It is not charity, it is not allyship, it is what should be the norm, but it's not. And so I feel like, a lot of people were posting stuff on the Black Lives Matter Batavia, what's happening in Batavia page, what's happening in these page, and I was getting floods of messages from predominantly older white people telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about, that I'm talking about whatever, making stuff up. And as a woman who I have not been taken seriously for so much, I do my research, I study, I really focus, I try to learn and educate, look at both sides, be unbiased. It is insulting to have people tell me that I have no clue what I'm talking about when I've read 5 books about a topic and research every day and find. I don't use social media as news sources. I don't have Twitter. I don't do that because people are saying incorrect information gets pushed. Also, social media attracts everything you like. They put things into your view that you agree with, that demonetizes stuff that you don't agree with, and that's why we have such polar opposites. But the thing is the people in power love that, because the more that the average person is divided, the easier it is for them to keep the power. So I find that when people are being quite rude and they are honestly insulting, when I'm just simply trying to encourage others to care about other people, I just step back. I tell them that I understand that that's what they believe in, but I encourage them to take a look. I will give them resources. I'll give them books, articles, YouTube videos. And at that point, you can't convince everybody, if you're always with people who agree with you, you're not going to make any change. You got to get out there. You got to confront people who don't agree with you. But after you've given them solid facts and you've encouraged them and you've tried to tell them the truth, after that, you have to step back and say your mental health is not worth being treated poorly due to political beliefs. So I find that if you stand your ground and you give respect and expect respect, you'll be fine. And if things go further, well, then that's you just gotta like block them or remove them from your life, because that's toxic and you don't need that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I think for me, what I do typically is I make sure I know my audience for sure. You got to speak to everybody differently and meet them where they're at. And the first thing I always try to do is, find out what their narrative is, right? People talk past each other because they don't know where that person's coming from, almost philosophically, right? And it's imperative to actually know the argument of the opposite of what you agree with, right? I read a lot of books I'm not a conservative, if you couldn't tell. I read a lot of books on conservatism, right? I know the history of it. I read Edmund Burke. I read the classical liberals like Friedrich Hayek. I read them thoroughly, right? So I know what people are going to say oftentimes to me before they know themselves, right? I know their arguments. I know the platitudes and the regurgitation. So what I do a lot of times is I approach it like Dr. Cornel West. I treat everybody like my brother, my sister, or my comrade, right? I got love for you. At the end of the day, most people do want to get to a place where they can have prosperity in their communities. They can have prosperity in their workplace. They have prosperity and have access to healthcare, education. It's just about how we go about doing it. Now, there are people who are on the fringe who don't want that. They might want like legitimate inequality, domination, and hierarchy. But like, I'm not trying to reach those people no way, right? And typically, though, most people are just apolitical, disinterested, and don't subscribe to an ideology, right? So when I'm talking to people, I always approach with love and empathy, and like, I give them the class analysis, which I think oftentimes is missing from most conversations of like, when I'm speaking to people who are Trump supporters, and I've spoken to a lot of Trump supporters and converted them, I talk about the failure of policy by both parties, right? They immediately trust me more because they're like, oh, this guy's not a Democrat, and I'm not, right? And I explain to them, well, the differences are negligible, brother. And I explain militarization. I explain imperialism. I explain the consensus of they're all imperialists, they're all capitalists. Those are the two things that are going to really mess up labor, right? I explain people like, if they're like really against immigration, I tell them this, I'm like, immigrants can't be taking your job, right? The undocumented people cannot be taking your job. Your job got sent overseas. It got automated away by the capitalists, right? They made that deliberate decision. So oftentimes I'll explain to them, right? And I won't approach it race first. I'll say race is a tool to divide the working class among racial lines so that they can further divide us, right? So oftentimes I explain through this polarization that we find is that it's deliberate and that I have no interest in like the narrative that the far right paints about the left. Rather, I have no interest in destroying America. I want to make this a place for everybody to feel heard, respect, and have access and have their labor not exploited in a way, right? And once you start talking about issues that matter to people, and once you like take out the ideology and just talk about the reality of the situation, and you kind of expose the contradictions of the American system, people, no matter where they're from, start being like, man, you might be onto something. I might have to read that book you just mentioned, right? So for me, I've had like, I think great success talking to people who are diametrically opposed to what I stand for, right? And I also never talk about my ideology. No one knows really what I believe in typically. I talk about the ideas of it, but you'll never hear me say I'm an ism, right? I'm this. I won't usually do that. I'll just come out and talk about the issue, how it can be improved, and why, and what I think people should be doing instead, right? And always leading first with empathy, right? And knowing the argument that I'm going to be opposed with. Because oftentimes people regurgitate things and I'm like, oh, I've heard that before, but have you considered this, right? So explaining the history, exposing the contradictions, and offering empirical evidence and examples of why something may not be true, right? So as long as you lead with love, typically most people will hear you out if you approach not locked into your own ideology too.
Yeah, and I think kind of just to expand on the first point that Nick mentioned is I think I've become a better advocate when I've developed a strong skill for listening. And so that means really understanding other people, not just what they're telling me, but what their body language is telling me, the subtext, and understanding their real fears. Because a lot of times opposition or hesitation comes from a fear of something. So, maybe if you're being told that it's your white privilege, maybe your fear is that like, oh my God, did I not get everything because I worked for it? Wait, was I upheld by the system that somehow like gave me everything? Like, what was everything for? And it kind of makes you question your identity. So most people don't want to go there because it's a lot of work. And I mean, I could attest to that. It is a lot of work to do that self-exploration. So I don't, blame people for wanting to sidestep that. But at the same time, you just even, understanding where people are coming from is really going to help you inform not just your messaging and how you're going to be, approaching them as well, but it's going to help you just expand your mindset and really understand people and understand that oftentimes at the end of the day, we're all scared of losing something. And that's where a lot of this comes from, right? And people are scared of losing power. People are scared of losing their status. People are scared of losing their little bit that they have. People are scared of losing their ability to survive. And so that's oftentimes why people may not take action, whether it's, undocumented workers who don't want to speak out because they're afraid of losing their livelihood, or, it could be the business owner who doesn't want to give some of their profits away because they don't want to lose their wealth. I think there's a lot of fear. And I think it evolves from we're still kind of primitive as a species. We still haven't really mastered the ability to kind of manage a lot of complex emotions and a lot of complex thoughts. So we're working together, being somewhat primitive. So we have to keep that in mind. But again, at the same time, listening, and you have to be able to sometimes work through things that you may not necessarily agree with. Like, for instance, one time I was speaking with an attorney general, actually, of a state, who told me, it's like, oh, back when I was working on anti-sexual assault stuff, it was like, well, we would send in the rape kits and we would try these cases, but, the girl, willingly went home with the guy and she was drunk. So, how could I get a jury to believe that? And I was just kind of like, oh my God, okay. Like, this guy, who's in charge of the legal system for the state doesn't believe that, women who are willingly go with a man can be violated by that man. He believes that if you're drinking alcohol, it's not a real rape. And I was just like, oh my God, this is a person in power, right? So I did have to go to the bathroom for a second and collect myself because I was seething with rage. But after that, I had to come back to him and be like, okay, but he's the one that I have to work with right now because he's the person in power. So how do I get around him? And the way I figured that out was that he actually had a task force of people who were working with him on this issue. So I asked if I could come and present to the task force and educate them on what sexual assault is and what the rape kit reform is. And they said yes, and I came. And then after that, there was just some silence in the room. And you could tell that they just kind of were thinking like, how does this work? How are we doing this? And actually in the past year or two, they've had some legislative reforms, and I've noticed the messaging that coming out of the Attorney General office is different. It's a lot more survivor centric. So, again, being able to really listen, being able to kind of work through some of that anger that you feel when you hear things that are just outlandish, but then being able to come back and educate and give them information in a way that makes sense to them. Because oftentimes I have seen research that says people, when presented with facts, people, instead of changing their mind, they're more likely to adhere to their own convictions. So, facts may not work. Maybe you have to do an emotional appeal. Maybe you have to go into like why personally this affects you, talk about your experience or friends or someone like that, of course, with permission, right? But they're being able to kind of, employ those tactics, I think will make you a pretty strong activist.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch upon the second part of her question, activist burnout is a really real phenomenon, which first of all, a lot of people don't know about, and therefore they may not know that they're experiencing, and it affects a lot of people who are deeply involved with these issues. So the first step in kind of recovering from that burnout is just taking care of yourself, figuring out what burnout feels like for you. And you can kind of distinguish this burnout from bad days if you find that it's persistent over time, if you experience it in more than one situation, and if it's a change from how you used to feel in similar situations. Many people become activists because they care about certain issues and how it affects people's lives. But by the time that we reach a point of needing a break, we may be suffering from compassion fatigue. And this can be a really confusing and jarring experience for individuals who entered this activist community because of their own compassion and caring and concern. But we have to realize that if we are depriving ourselves of our own needs, eventually our time, energy, and resources that we spend helping others will also deplete and will also run out. So sometimes the best way to treat this activist burnout is just by taking a break. Whether it's a temporary break from social media or just not watching the news for a few days, just identifying what's best for you and what you need, and then taking the necessary steps to take care of yourself first is just the first and most comprehensive step to recovery.
Thank you. That was great. Just the next question, what type of advice would you give to someone like maybe a middle schooler or a young high school student that hasn't quite gotten involved, but maybe they've just learned of the issues and they want to get involved, but they don't know how to start, they don't know what to do? What type of advice would you give them? What are some things they can do, as well as what challenges do you think they will face when they first start?
Well, challenge-wise, they'll have everybody and everyone telling them that that they will not make a difference. The first Black Lives Matter protest that I went to, this was before I was involved. This is before I would give speeches or educate others on white privilege. I literally came home. My mother was furious at me because she was like, "I can't believe you would do that. You don't actually make a difference. There's enough people there already. Why would you go out there?" My mom, who knows that this is what I'm passionate about. And before I took a stance and spoke, that's what I heard a million times. But how did I get into it? Through school, if you don't have an activism club at your school, then you can make one. You have the opportunities to go with your administration to make a club, whether that be you want to focus on Latinx or LGBTQIA or overall, that's up to you. You could make a club. Educating yourself. If you're young and you don't have things like Facebook and stuff like that, where you can find people with the same like mind and with things going on, you can ask your parents. And if they don't agree with you, then you can, again, I say reach out to trusted adults that you care about. And there's millions of ways to get involved. Your challenges are you're going to constantly be told that you don't know what you're talking about and you don't know how the world works, even though you can do the research and figure it out pretty easily. And I really I think if you're a young activist and you're listening to this, I mean, you will be told a million and one times that what you're doing doesn't matter, that we are deteriorating the structure of the United States for seeking equality, but you are valid, and do not lose your empathy, because I really feel like empathy can really get beaten out of you in this world, because everyone's dealing with their own stuff. So when you're dealing with your own stuff, why do I have to care about other people's stuff? Well, you do, because we're all little pieces in the machine of mankind, and every little piece is important, and that's why you should care about other people. So I really feel like stay inspired, self-care, like what Shreya was saying is know what respect you deserve. And if you are feeling burnt out, you are not being respected, then you don't have to continue to pursue whatever is burning you out. You can self-care and move into different directions. I really just stay inspired, stay updated. Do not choose one political side to stay with, because they're run by rich people who really don't care except getting power. So I just really feel like, you are so important, and your opinion matters, your voice matters, your story matters, and you are smarter than people will make you feel. That's it.
Yeah, that's great advice, especially about the political party. Like, don't feel like you have to be like, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican or I'm a Democratic Socialist. Like, spend time figuring it out. And if you do decide to join one of those parties, that's great. But just don't feel like you can't ever criticize them because you're a part of them. If you ever have concerns with them, definitely talk to people about them. Definitely be like, hey, this is the problem. This is what I'd like to see improve, because this is how I feel that this party whatever party it may be is not really serving the people. So you can be an agent of change even within the political party that you choose. If you choose one, you may not, but whatever organization you're in, be able to and willing to speak out, even if it's just a, you know, community group that you feel is maybe not headed in the right direction. You know, feel free to talk to people about it. But I would say for someone younger who's wanting to get involved, I would say read. Just read a lot. I mean, I feel like maybe this is a plug for the Aurora Public Library, but definitely, you know, read not just nonfiction, you know, where you're reading about the issues or whatever, but I love fiction. And I think the reason why I love fiction is because it helps me develop an empathy skill, because I'm constantly traveling into other people's worlds, and I get immersed into someone who is, you know, Alaskan native who's 85 years old, you know, who's obviously very different from me. And then I get transported to some, you know, whatever, some other world, you know, in another part of the world, in another time in the world. So definitely I think reading fiction is surprisingly a really great way to develop empathy, which will allow you to become a really strong advocate in whatever you decide to do.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but just the high school students, is there any questions that you wanted to ask the panelists while we're here, as well as if there's any questions from the audience, we'll now be answering them. If there are no questions from the West High students, Valerie, or Valeria, sorry. I thought you were gonna say something, sorry. Okay. Let's see. So then for the closing questions, what are the most critical changes that we must take to face the future effectively, both locally and on a broader scale?
I'll go real quick. The mode of production, right? There is no grappling with the ecological disaster unless you change that. Pursuing profits on endlessly, perpetually on a planet with finite resources, not going to work. It produces perpetual warfare, and it produces all the other inequities, right? You're going to have to change this mode of production. People are going to have to get on board with some form of changing that. And if you're not willing to do that, the work on racial equality won't work. The race on gender equality won't work. You won't save the planet. We're going to continue being in wars, exploiting countries for their resources, whether it's, you know, through finance capital or predatory loans or through militarization, right? They're going to have to change this mode of production that pursues profit by any means necessary. And I think that's the core causal root of everything, of how our society is arranged, right? The mode of production, how labor is watched or seen. And I think until we like grapple with that and realize we have to change that, everything else is going to continue to be kind of chaotic, right? And for me, I think that's why in anything work that you do, bring up those class questions, bring up that mode of production of like, what can we do different, right? We can't continue expanding the empire. We can't continue ravishing the planet for resources. We can't continue fighting each other, or the human experiment and the American democratic experiment will come to an end.
I think it'll be also activating Black and Brown people to be engaged and active in whatever form they choose. And I think, sure, sometimes it's, you know, like I alluded to earlier about confidence, but also, you know, don't forget that Black and Brown people have been systematically excluded from the policymaking process at every level of policy for centuries. And so it makes sense that you're told by your family that it doesn't matter because, well, like they weren't able to, right? And they were sometimes legally excluded from these bodies that made decisions about their lives. And so I think re-engaging Black and Brown communities, and as particularly I think the middle-aged folks, I think I've seen a lot more activism from young folks, but you know, with older millennials, Gen X, and even, you know, some boomers, getting them on board and explaining to them that, you know, they do matter, and there are ways that they can take action. And whether it's, you know, calling their senator, whether it's participating in food drives, whether it's, just talking to their neighbor about, whatever they think is most important right now. It's really going to be about engaging them and our communities. And so I'm excited to see what this younger generation is going to do in that regard. And so thank you guys all for your activism.
I think that just to quickly add, in terms of affecting change at a local level, one of the most important things that younger people can do is just ensure that we hold our government officials accountable. Just as a recent example, Pete DeCiani, he was a former DuPage County board member, and I believe he was the chairman of the DuPage County Health Commission. And in July, he attended a pro-police rally, and at that rally, he violated social distancing guidelines completely, and he actually yelled at very closely. He yelled and spit in the face of one of his constituents who was counter protesting. So obviously, someone like that, we don't want someone like that representing our community, which is so diverse and full of different people with different values and different perspectives. Someone who violates social distancing guidelines in the middle of a global pandemic should not be allowed to have that position of power. So the committee took a vote, and he was, fortunately, he lost his position on the county board, but that's just one very, very small example of holding our government officials accountable, making sure that they actually live up to the law and making sure that they continue to reflect our values and our interests. Because if policymakers don't reflect their constituency, then honestly, it's not a democracy.
You're on mute, Kathy.
You're mute.
Okay, thank you. We're almost out of time. Was there any last comments, anything that you guys wanted to add in before we close out? Or if there's any resources that you'd like to share for anyone starting out?
Yeah, I think I just want to say never be intimidated to do this justice work. And I talk to a lot of elected officials on every level of government. They're not as smart as you think they are. Just do the work, and I guarantee you, you read maybe 1 or 2 books, you know more than them. So never be intimidated by the work. It seems daunting, but I promise you, you can make a difference when you collectivize power. And if anybody wants resources, my contact information will be accessible, and I'll give you a list of books on any topic you want to read about.
Yeah, I would really just say that even if your friends or your family don't agree with you and they are putting you down for stuff you're passionate about, then they're not, you don't need to worry about them. And I'd say, again, libraries and books. I have learned more from books than I did in 12 years of school. And I don't know what's going on about that, but I'd really just say, put down the phone, put down TikTok and although it's great uses, but TikTok and Instagram and Facebook for even an hour a day, put your phone away and immerse yourself into something bigger than yourself. And it will be so fruitful and rewarding, and it will really work on your soul. And it's just worth it to be involved in something that you're passionate about.
And I just encourage you guys to keep asking questions. I think, something like this is great, asking people who are activists or who have done the work, what is it like? What are you doing? That's great. But, anybody could be a resource for you. Talk to your teachers, talk to your coach, talk to your librarian, talk to anybody that you think might be able to point you in the right direction. And my rule is always ask the same question to at least 3 adults. When I was in college, I kind of assumed adults just knew everything. So I would ask one and I took that as the answer. And then later on, I became an adult and I was like, oh my God, I don't know anything. They didn't know anything either. So, just to get a variety of perspectives, ask a lot of people, ask questions. And some people might be annoyed by your questions, but that's okay. I think it might just be because they've never been asked. But I think you asking questions is going to go a long way.
I have a question, but it's out of anything that's talking about. There is a lot of people who's gonna do their citizenship right now, but they mostly doesn't speak that good English, or they doesn't know how to study for the citizenship Like the library, does the library do anything for that to help them study for their citizenship?
Sarah, that's a really, really great question. And I'll just jump in with that. We do offer programming on citizenship and immigration, and we work with World Relief in downtown Aurora to provide supplemental programming there too. So keep your eye on the library website because we do have resources for that. And every branch has what's called a citizenship corner that provides resources and tools to use for studying and working towards that. So very, very good question. Thanks. I think I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Kathy as our moderator. Thank you to Rachel as our sign language interpreter. We appreciate it. And thank you to all of our panelists and the West High students for being here. We have, this was amazing. We've had some really positive comments on Facebook that I'd just really like to share. People are saying that there are so many amazing people and young people here. So thank you for your passion and advocacy. And one commenter says, I have hope for the future when listening to all of these young people. So thank you for your inspiration and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
This is wonderful.
Thank you.